So now we're going to have a look at the LFO. Now we have 3 of these, LFO 1, 2, and 3 located down here. And we access them by clicking on the LFO tab at the bottom here. Now LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. Now this isn't a course on basic synthesis, but just as a quick overview for people that have never come across an LFO, it's basically like an oscillator that we use to create the sound, but these are oscillators that don't actually make a sound themselves, but we use them to change other parameters periodically over time. Now this is really important when you have sounds that sustain, because sometimes the sustain phase can be a little bit boring and a little bit too artificial from a synthesizer, and using an LFO allows us to bring that to life a little bit, because the ear very quickly gets used to something which remains the same. So just having gentle periodic modulations or more extreme modulations can really help a sound kind of retain our interest. Now in the real world, this would be akin to a guitarist kind of vibrating a string to create that pitch vibrato, or a tremolo effect by modulating the volume. Those kind of things are the traditional ways that we can employ an LFO. But of course, we could do far more extreme things when it comes to synthesizers, because we're not necessarily trying to recreate a real sound. Instead, we maybe are trying to create something which is kind of artificial sounding, so we can use LFOs more creatively. Okay, so let's have a look at the parameters of the LFO. So first thing we need to do is actually route it to something so we can hear what it's doing. Let's choose a wavetable. Let's try a little formant. And in the mod matrix, let's choose a source as LFO1, destination as oscillator 1, wavetable position. And let's bring the amount up. So we can hear that movement of the LFO. Let's just bring the amount down for a second. So that's without that position being modulated. And the amount dial allows us to specify the amount we're going to modulate the destination parameter, in this case oscillator 1 wavetable position. So as I said, LFOs are oscillators, low frequency oscillator. So we have many of the same shapes that we have for our virtual analog oscillators. So we have sine, triangle, ramp up, ramp down, pulse, sample and hold, sample and glide, and a random pulse. So by changing these up, we're going to get different results. A little bit Morse code, that one. So you can hear that using these different shapes, we can create some different kind of results. Now the rate knob allows us to specify the speed of that oscillation. So it goes all the way up to 250 Hertz, which is in the audible range. Let's put it back to sine. So when it goes that fast, it almost takes on a pitch of its own, essentially. Now, if we're going for more kind of vibrato, tremolo style effects, they're generally going to be slower. So maybe somewhere between 3 and 6 Hertz. Let's just fine tune this a bit. In fact, let's place this on oscillator 1 volume. So that's going to be more of a tremolo style effect. So you can hear how much more interesting that is than it has that extra movement to it which creates interest. Now the rate control can be synced to the project tempo. And when it's synced, you'll see now we're dealing with beats and bars. So if you want something which is synced to the project, make sure you click sync. So next up we have this poly button here. Let's just switch off sync. And now we're no longer syncing to project tempo. Now when poly is switched on, it allows us to have a local LFO for each one of our 8 voices. So let's increase our voices so we have 8. And let's compare the results. In fact, let's put it on something even more obvious, like the semitone control of oscillator 1. Let's turn the rate down a bit. So now we have each one of our voices being controlled by the same LFO. So you can hear us jumping on the LFO cycle at various different points. If we put poly on, now each voice has its own LFO. So it's giving us a different kind of attack. It's giving us a different result there. Okay, so fade in allows us to fade in the effect of the LFO. So you can hear that at work. And again, that's adding an extra layer of interest because it's slowly fading up the modulation. Next up, we have this offset control that allows us to add or subtract an offset from the LFO output. So you can hear what that's doing there. And of course, the amount allows us to fine tune the amount of LFO output we're sending. So you can hear that there. Now, as I said, we have 3 LFOs, so loads of flexibility to route these around to control parameters over time periodically. Okay, so that's our LFO. So to recap, LFO low frequency oscillator allows us to periodically change the sound over time, especially important when we have a sound which sustains, where you want to create kind of interest that helps the listener retain focus on the sound. We have the rate control that allows us to determine the speed of this modulation. We can sync it to project tempo. If we have multiple voices, we can have each one of those voices with its own independent LFO, or alternatively one LFO kind of master for all the voices. We have different shapes that we can choose from. We have a fade in to bring that effect in slowly over time, offset to add or subtract an offset from the LFO output, and also the amount to fine tune the amount of signal we're sending out for the low frequency oscillator. So that's our LFOs covered. In the next video, we're going to have a look at our multiple segment envelope generators. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.